and welcome to our 12th episode of Two Tankers and a Cat. We're your hosts. I'm Charlie.
And this is Russell.
Well, Russell, we are going to get some hate mail. We are going to be talking about the M4 Sherman and why it was a great tank.
Oh, boy. I guess I might have to give him your personal email for that. I don't know.
Oh, no, don't do that. Lightning is here with us tonight. Russell had been telling me that he tried the laser dot, putting the little laser dot in front of the cat and watch it run over. My cat goes just crazy over it. I said, oh, no, you're not doing it right. So I bring the laser dot over to, Lightning and start throwing it in front of her. And she's like, oh, no. I'm not falling for the red dot trick. It's usually connected to a rifle.
Yeah, she's definitely no dummy when it comes to the red dot.
Well, before we get started on what's going to be a ton of hate mail, we want to give a shout out to our international listeners. We are just growing like crazy. We've got Korea, Vietnam, Australia, Russia, UK, just all over, and we are just so grateful to you guys. But we do have a kind of a request for our American listeners. We're missing a few states that nobody's downloaded in our Wyoming, New Mexico, and the East Coast.
Yeah, the Northeast, the very northeastern part of the country.
So if you're listening, feel free to share us on your Facebook page, or if you got a relative, or somebody up east, tell them to give us a listen.
Well, yeah, help us get the word out there, and they may even like it. Who knows?
Oh, gosh, I hope they like it. People are still saying, well, the message I got on Facebook, the lady from the UK was wanting us to get a yardstick and lay Lightning down and see, really show her how long that cat is.
Oh, wow, yeah, we'll do that someday. I never even thought about that. But
yeah, I figure if you take the picture and I'm sitting there, rubbing her belly and laying her flat out.
She may be a Guinness Book World Record holder.
People, you really have no idea how long this cat is. This is a very, very long cat. We are going to jump in on the Sherman. Boy, here it goes. Like I said, my key point is why the Sherman is the best tank on the Western Front. Tell us a little bit about the M4 beginning, Russ.
Yeah, the M4 Sherman, it was actually named after the famous American Civil War general, William T. Sherman. M4 Sherman is one of the few really iconic fighting vehicles of the Allies during World War II, and one of the most famous tanks in world history. But while this historic status was gained partly thanks to its intrinsic qualities, but also due to the sheer numbers in which they were provided, and that was only surpassed by the Soviet Union's T-34, with a staggering 50,000 total delivered.
Now the T-34 was over 50,000. They made a lot of those.
Wow.
And we will do an episode on the T-34.
Oh, yes.
And its variants, because I know a lot of people are like, well, what about the T-34-85? I think we mix all that up.
Oh, yeah. It remains by far the most widely used tank on the Allied side during the war. It was derived into countless derivatives and had very long post-war career, which lasted well into the Cold War. It has been largely compared to the T-34 and had the occasion to confront some during the Korean War. The M4 is actually still in use today.
When we do that episode of the T-34, maybe we can do some research and see the Sherman against the T-34.
There you go.
Again, I like the T-34. I've got problems with the T-34, but that's why I'm going for just saying the M4 was the best on the Western Front, because I do like some of the Russian stuff. When I start talking, I got a mail, and it wasn't really a hate mail. It's like, hey, it sounds like that you don't like the German tanks. And I'm like, no, I love the Tiger tank. I love the Jag Tiger. It's just, unfortunately, they had some big problems. That's one of the things that we want to address is, yes, we enjoy these tanks, but in reality, they had some severe problems. Now, we were talking about, the M4 is still in use. We're talking about the Super Sherman. If you don't know, the Israelis and the French worked out actually a Super Sherman, and we'll try to get into that in a second episode. This is actually going to be a two-parter, I think. I think we'll take M4 1, and then we're going to do a little break and wait for everybody to listen to it, to write us back and throw some hate mails so I can answer. And if somebody's like, hey, I have a question about this M4, there's a ton of variants.
Yes, there are.
But like we were saying, there's still the M4 in use today. In fact, I think it was Peru that just put a couple back into operating.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. Yeah.
Of course, them are Super Shermans.
Yeah.
But still a Sherman. One of my favorite stories about the Sherman being used in a war was when we went down to Fort Benning and talked to Rob. And Rob had explained, we were walking through, and we saw this old destroyed Sherman. And I said, wow. I said, where'd you get this one? And he goes, well, this one's got a pretty interesting story. And I'm like, okay, I got time. Tell me. He says, well, the way it's destroyed like now, it got hit by a Stinger missile. And I'm like, was it target practice? And he goes, no, we got it in Desert Storm. And I'm like, what do you mean you got it in Desert Storm? Apparently, this was a Lend-Lease tank that we gave to Russia. Then it was captured by the Germans. And then the Americans captured it again. And we gave it to the Italians. Then the Italians gave it to the Iranians. And then the Iranians had it in their war against Iraq. And then the Iraqis captured it and turned it into a battle against the Americans. And one of our flying military vehicles shot a Stinger at it, shot it right through the engine and killed it. And they finally said, you know what, bring that back home.
Yeah, that's been around a few places there.
Well, that's a tough tank. So anybody that says, hey, the Sherman was kind of junk, I'm like, it took a Stinger to kill this one. 60 years later.
Oh, exactly, yeah.
Well, not 60, but let's talk about some of the myths of the Shermans. I know Russ has got a bunch of questions for me, and people, when you saying, oh, wait a minute, where are you getting your facts? I've researched a bunch of this. We've talked to Rob down in the curator for the Fort Benning Armored. And if you guys really want in-depth information, I got to give props to the guy who actually set me straight. I thought the M4 was kind of a junk tank too. We see in the movies, it catches fire and it just blows up and then they shoot right through it and it was crap. One of the guys who helped me understand more is one of the researchers from our digital game, World of Tanks. His name is Nicholas Moran. He's also named the Chieftain. If you get a chance, he's got his own YouTube channel. It's the Chieftain, and he actually did a episode, American Armor Myths. And I never believe anybody. I go and research it, and the guy's right. He got all his information from the archives, and this is how it was. Have you seen that episode?
I believe I have, yeah. Yeah, I watched that the other day, and that's really interesting.
All right, Russ, I know you got some questions for me, so let's shoot.
Well, Charlie, wasn't it true American tanks were not designed to fight other tanks?
This has been brought up quite a bit, and it's simply not true. And when the evidence is examined, you'll see that U.S. forces did quite well in a study of 87 tank engagements involving the 3rd and the 4th Armored Divisions. U.S. actually destroyed more enemy tanks and equipment than they lost. And in these engagements, they were quite often fighting Panthers and Panzer IVs. In the first 3 examples in the study, which involved a total of 27 engagements, a total of 155 M4s faced off against 114 Panthers. The U.S. actually only lost 10 M4s, while the Germans lost 70 Panthers.
Wow.
And these are archived actual battles.
Yeah.
And out of all these engagements, we lost, 10 M4s.
That's incredible. That's an
Against
incredible figure.
70 Panthers. So that kind of says, well, it wasn't made to kill tanks. Yeah, it was. That's the short answer.
Yeah. I mean, I see where you're coming from there. Yeah. Well, wasn't the Sherman a matchstick and catch fire like the Ronson lighter ad? Lights every time?
Here's the thing on the Ronson ad. That ad was actually in the 50s. And how that happened, it must have been that, after the war, people would talk, and a lot of people were bad-mouthing the Sherman. They're like, oh, it's just like the Ronson would light every time. But they weren't actually saying that when they had the tank. That was an advertisement. They didn't even start till the 50s.
I see.
Now, did the Sherman catch fire? Absolutely, when it first came out. But as with everything in America, we modify and make it better and make it better and make it better. Even our Abrams, you were telling us that they're upgrading that and modifying it now.
I read that the other day where they're modifying it, yeah.
And there's people out there that will tell you the M4 or the Abrams is just a terrible tank. And I'm like, if you look at it, statistically instead of tactically. And that's where a lot of people are having problems. Most people look at things tactically, and you want to look at the big picture and statistically. Everybody says, oh, well, the Panther was way better than the Sherman. Well, I can pull the battle reports like I just did, and we lost 10 tanks, and the Panthers lost 70. And they're like, well, that's because the Germans were using, old men and children to run these tanks. And I'm not going to debate that. But you got to remember, some of our M4 crews, these guys were getting thrown straight in. I know the movie The Fury is just a terrible example. They just grabbed some random kid out of infantry and said, hey, you're our gunner.
Wow.
And that really did happen. They were trying to put people in. In Russia, me and Russ is actually a better expert on Russian Lend-Lease than I am, and we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I agree. That'll probably make a whole episode in itself, to be honest with you.
Even in Russia, we learned there's a terminology called a horseless tanker. And what a horseless, it means that they were trained to be tankers, but they didn't have tanks.
Didn't have enough tanks to outfit them all, yeah.
And that's why, the British and U.S. was sending them tanks, and as soon as they'd get them, they'd load them up and head out. People say, well, the Sherman was catching fire because of the gasoline. No, what the main problem was, it was the ammunition. The ammunition wasn't in wet racks. So we modified that, and when we did that, the tank would only catch fire 5 to 10% of the time. And I know people are going to go, no, that's wrong. Don't take our word for it. Go to the archives, research yourself.
Yes.
You'll find out that wet racks really reduced it that massive.
Wow.
In fact, people say, well, they had the ammo storage, in a bad spot. I'm like, well, it's the same spot that the Panther had its ammo and the Tiger had its ammo on the side.
That's true, yeah.
Did it catch fire in the beginning? Yeah, because we weren't ready in the beginning, Everybody always says, well, the Germans have the Tiger and the King Tiger and all this. Got to remember, you did the episode on the M2, right?
Yes, uh-huh.
And then from the M2, we went to the M3. And we knew what worked on the M3. We knew the 75 was killing tanks. And they came up with the M4. Everybody says, well, why were there so many M3s? I think we said there were 6,500 M3s because the Russians and the British needed those tanks.
Exactly. And that kind of goes back to your, the Lend-Lease program. And Americans weren't the only ones using most of the tanks we were producing in America.
So when America did go to war, it was usually, we were taking the best stuff. People are like, oh, what are you talking about? Well, look at the M1 Grand rifle. Russ, do you know any rifle better than the Grand, the old M1?
Not right off the top of my head. I don't know. It's still up there, yeah.
It's still a high-quality gun. If you've never had a chance to shoot one, get ready for a kick.
Yeah.
But yeah, in the beginning, it did have flame problems. It wasn't because of the gasoline. It was because of the ammunition. And when they installed wet racks, it did change. It wasn't burning as much.
Yeah, I remember listening to Rob Cogan's story there on there at Fort Benning about when they added the wet racks, and that opened my eyes, and I understand a lot more on why that actually
cut down
worked. I mean, yeah, it makes sense.
Even the reports on the German, like the Panzer IV, the Panzer IV caught fire 80% of the time.
That's an incredible amount there.
When the Germans were waiting on the Panthers to go into Kursk, for the Battle of Kursk, they were actually held up waiting for these Panthers, and like 8 of them caught fire just going there.
Oh, man.
Not even getting shot at.
Man.
You know what? The M4 did not catch fire driving down
Just
the road.
driving down the road, yeah.
So what other questions you got?
This is actually a pretty good one. Why is the Sherman M4 tank the way it is?
Well, everybody says, well, we could have made all these different, bigger tanks. The M6 was a heavy tank that they were working on, and it was a 60-ton tank. And when you think about the United States getting into a fight, what's 2 of the biggest problems that we have going to war, Russ? Do you know?
Well, I'm going to say transportation probably is going to be up there.
Believe it or not, the 2 toughest things that the United States, when it goes to war, is the 2 oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic. You have to think, okay, we have to ship everything.
Exactly.
We got to ship rifles, medical supplies, ammunition, just everything.
Yeah.
And the tanks and the gasoline. We have to ship all that.
It's all got to go overseas.
So when they come up with this, they have to, contact the railroads and say, well, how much weight can your flat cars carry? What are the rail bridges going to be like? When you get the tanks to the shipping yard, how much is the Liberty ship cranes, able to lift? Is it going to lift a 60-ton tank?
Yeah. I mean, it's all in the logistics. I mean, all that's got to be planned out.
And when you do get into, let's say Tripoli or North Africa, what kind of unloading gear do they have? What kind of, how much weight can their docks put?
Do they even have any gear? Or are you going to have to take the
gear with you?
The gear with you, yeah.
These are things that these guys have to plan out. And what a tremendous workload. Can you imagine having to come up with all the things, like we were saying, even the oil and lubricants and, believe it or not, even the food, the cooking utensils and
very true.
And shipping all that over there. And it's just tremendous just to get one tank over. And do you want to ship one 60-ton heavy tank, or do you want to ship 2 30-ton tanks and get them there quicker?
Yeah, it's a good way to look at it.
And, the Americans, they like easy. Something that's easy to work on, easy to maintain, and that we have the capability of using parts from one tank to another. I think we've talked about this before, that you couldn't take the Panther wheels and put them on a Tiger. Is that correct?
Yeah, we've talked about that before, yeah.
They were actually using like the M3 Lee's suspension. We knew this. We had the 75 guns. We were making those. If you look at how the M4 is, the very front, the bolts, you undo those bolts, you can pull out the transmission pretty easy and put another one in.
Yeah.
You got to remember, these transmissions burn out on these tanks a lot.
Oh, I could just imagine, yeah.
The Panzer IV, you literally had to take off the turret and take out the passenger or the gunner and the driver's seats
Holy cow.
to get the engine out. So can you imagine trying to drop an engine out in the middle of a field? You'd have to send it back to the factory.
You would, yeah. You would have to take it to the back lines to, yeah.
And there's all sorts of memoirs and stuff where our tanks would get hit or damaged, and we'd send them right back, and our crews would put in a new transmission, fill the hole, redo the wiring, and boom, it's back out on the street.
Ready to go. Hey.
So that's kind of why the Sherman is the way it is. It was reliable, it had tons of parts, and they knew they couldn't ship it back to get it fixed at the factory. They had to have it where they could fix it right then and there.
Okay, the next question to you, Charlie, is why the 75 millimeter gun and not the 17-pounder gun that the UK put on the Firefly?
We actually had some tanks with the 17-pounder on it. People are like, oh, we had to get a bigger gun. You got to remember, the theater commanders didn't want a bigger gun. They were pretty happy with the 75. They were killing tanks in Africa and Italy. The Americans did have the 17-pounder, and when they did test, they found out our 76 millimeter was better. So it wasn't an American pride thing, or we're not going to use a British 17-pounder. It was great, except when they put the 17-pounder in, they had to turn it on its side, and it was cramped as crazy in that poor little turret. And these guys are, having to move and load and kind of shuffle around in this tight turret. And we basically came up with the 76. They did an accuracy test at distance, maximum range and stuff. The 17-pounder was losing accuracy, and the 76 was dead on. So that's why we use the 76. It's just, oh boy, this is going to get us some hate mail. The 76 was a little bit better than the 17-pounder. People say, well, what are you talking about? The 76 was junk. And I'm like, do you like the Hellcat? And they're like, oh yeah, we love the Hellcat. Yeah. The Hellcat had the 76 millimeter.
What was the Hobart's Funnies?
Hobart's Funnies is just the variants of the M4 that people thought were kind of like funny. I hope we get some, for this episode, we get to put some of the funny pictures.
Yeah.
The Sherman had a they actually had a mine-finding Sherman, which was just like a rolling barrel on the front with these ball and chains. And when the tank would roll, these ball and chains would smack the ground and get these mines to blow up. So, okay, the place has got landmines, and the infantry's up there like, hey, man, we ain't got time to cut through there. You got to make us a path. And the guy's like, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get a big barrel, and we're going to put a bunch of chains and balls on them, and then we're going to roll it across the ground and wait for it to blow up. Okay, all right. But did it work? Yeah, it worked. The Sherman bridge layer. People are like, well, what are you talking about? Yeah. We actually had bridge laying Shermans that were out there laying bridges, and they're like, oh, that's funny. Here comes a Sherman. It's got a bridge on top of its roof, and it's like, okay, laying that down. And if you look at the pictures of the Normandy invasion, it looks like a little boat, and it was just like a canvas, and they made these Shermans. They put propellers on them, and people are like, oh, you're crazy, that never happened. Yes, it really did. We've got pictures that had propellers, and they'd pull up this canvas and make a little raft out of this Sherman, and they'd just drive.
Man.
They'd unload it and drive this little boat Sherman up to the beach, and then
awesome.
get in the fight.
That's awesome.
So there's a ton of these Shermans. There was even like a flamethrower Sherman. What was that called? Was it called Crocodile or
Zippo?
Zippo.
Yeah. The American version, I believe, was the Zippo.
That's right, because the Churchill that we did the episode on was the Crocodile.
Now, don't get me wrong. I think I did read somewhere where the UK called their version of the Sherman flamethrower, the crocodile also. So maybe that's probably where that came from.
Right. But we were talking about the bridge layer. They actually called the bridge layer the Plymouth. They were like, hey, bring a Plymouth out there. And it was just a Sherman tank with a Bailey bridge on it. And they also used some of the M4s for armored recovery vehicles. Some of these vehicles, trucks and Jeeps, or even other tanks that were, damaged out in the battlefield and still a little hot, they'd go out there and hook these things up, take them back, and of course, fix them up,
bring them back in, and wow. So what you're telling me, the Sherman was a pretty big workhorse. I mean, it just didn't go out and be a tank.
Well, that's true. But I think the thing that we're trying to point is it was used to fill the roles that it was needed to fill.
Okay, the next question to you, Charlie. Would a round from a Sherman really go through the front of a Tiger tank?
I get all of this. People are like, oh, the Tiger, there's tons of stories, and there's tons of documentaries where the Tiger, getting shot at would just bounce and bounce and bounce. We all know that the Tiger had 4 inches of steel armor on the front. 4 inches is pretty thick.
Oh, yeah, it is.
But again, we'll get into the armor part of the Sherman. But the 76 millimeter, when it was firing the high velocity armor piercing, it's called a HVAP round. When that became available in August of 1944 for the 76 millimeter gun, the projectile contained a tungsten penetrator surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body and a ballistic windshield, which gave it a higher velocity and more penetrating power. The increased penetration of the HVAP round allowed the 76 gun to match the Panther's 7.5 centimeter KWK-42 APCR shot. However, its performance was heavily degraded by sloped armor, such as the Panther Glacius and stuff like that. But the Tiger had a flat, armor front. So these, 76 tungsten rounds would go through a Tiger no problem. The problem there was a shortage of HVAP rounds. There was a shortage of tungsten because we were using our tungsten supplies for tools and other, stuff that the military needed.
That makes sense, yeah.
The HVAP rounds were constantly in short supply. Priority was given to the U.S. tank destroyers, and over half of the 18,000 projectiles received were not compatible with the 76 millimeter gun being fitted for the Shermans. They were actually using the 76 M1 that was fitted for like the M10 tank destroyers. But, most Shermans carried a few rounds for some of these threats. Like, when they came out. People say only a 76 would kill a Tiger. Like I keep telling everybody, if you look at the engagements in North Africa and Italy and Sicily, we were killing these Panthers and Tigers, but we were also killing with the 75 millimeter. Everybody's like, well, 75 won't go through a Tiger. We had a white phosphorus shell. A lot of people don't like talking about this because the white phosphorus was not supposed to be used for the anti-tank round, I guess. The shell was originally intended to use as an artillery marker to help with targeting. The M4 would, shoot this white phosphorus where they wanted the artillery to, shoot. Well, the M4 crews discovered that the shell could also be used against the Tigers and Panthers. When the burning white phosphorus adhered to German tanks, their excellent optics would be blinded. The smoke would get sucked inside the vehicle. The vents that were, that used to cool. White phosphorus smoke is kind of dangerous.
Probably pretty toxic, yeah.
Pretty toxic. And it made it difficult or impossible for the crews to breathe. This and the fear of the fire starting, because remember, these Tigers and Panthers and even the Panzer IVs were catching fire all the time. So here you get hit with like the derp gun 105 or the 75, and you're hit with a white phosphorus, and it's burning and it's smoking and it's getting sucked inside the vehicle, and you can't see to shoot, basically burning your tank up all around there, and you can't breathe. This would cause the crew to abandon the tank. There are several recorded instances where white phosphorus shells defeated German tanks in this fashion.
Man, that's crazy. It's interesting. I've never come across that information before, but yeah, that is.
When you start looking at, the archives, talking to guys that really knew the Sherman, and they're like, oh yeah, we saw Panther and we had the 75 or the 105. We loaded a white phosphorus and shot that thing, and it would just, all of a sudden the crews would be bailing out. And I'm like,
I don't know. If my tank was shot with white phosphorus and the sucker was on fire, it would get my attention.
Yep.
It really would.
Yep. Time to bail.
You're darn right. Charlie, the Sherman didn't have armor, did it?
Here we go again. The perfect example is the Tiger had 4 inches armor, like we said. At first, they had the sloping. The M4 was, sloped a little bit, but everybody's like, no, they would shoot through the front of it. Well, we did up armor them. Again, we modified in the field. We're adding extra armor and stuff like that, like your jumbo tanks and your Easy 8s later. They basically put on 4 inches of hull armor. People are like, no, it only had 3 inches. Well, it was sloped. And when it's a sloped armor, it gives you extra armor rating, I guess.
Yeah.
And basically, the Jumbo had about 4 inches of armor, which is the same as the Tiger tank. So if you say, the Sherman didn't have armor, you're saying the Tiger didn't. One of Russia's tank, or Soviet Union's tank aces, Dmitry, you're going to talk about this later.
Yeah.
He was talking about how he'd get hit several times and, it would just bounce, it'd make big gouges and stuff. But they were walking away from these after getting shot. So the Jumbo did have armor. It had the same armor as the Tiger.
Yeah.
And when they got the T-20 turrets, they had 3.5 inches of spaced armor on the mantle. So, yeah, the Sherman did have armor.
And I found it interesting, kind of one of the things I took away from Fort Benning, since they had so many variants of the Sherman down there. I may actually put some audio. I took some audio from that little deal down there at Fort Benning.
We really need to
from Rob Cogan, the curator down there. But anyway, what I was getting at, with so many variants, they were putting armor in so many different places. I think they called it a pleak armor or whatever.
Pleak, yeah.
Yeah, where they were. One of the biggest things was, they were getting ammo. Or, I don't know, in the game, I guess we would call it ammo racked. But being shot in the side where they stored the ammo
would damage
yeah, and it would.
Yeah, and out in the field, they put plates on it.
Yeah, they would weld plates to the outside of this to make it thicker.
Well, it's like the original M4 versions had sloped armor, but they noticed where the driver and the front gunners hatches were.
Yeah, I remember seeing that in a variant. Yeah,
they were weak.
Yeah,
and believe it or not, and I think it was when we finally invaded Sicily, they actually started welding more armor on those particular variants of the Sherman, so they wouldn't be weak.
Yeah.
So then they basically welded on that pleak armor you were talking about.
Yeah.
To take away the weak spots. So it up-armored them.
So they were constantly beefing up the armor.
Right.
Once they found the weak spots.
You got to remember, by the time the Sherman got to the Korean War, that's a pretty solid tank.
Oh, you're right. It was. Yeah.
And even after that, the Israelis and the French, they up-armored to the Super Sherman. And we'll talk about that because that thing was ridiculous.
Yeah.
If we had that at the beginning of...
Wow.
I
know.
That thing would shoot through anything.
I know.
We needed the Super Sherman beginning in North Africa.
I guess my next question is, the Sherman was a death trap and not survivable, was it?
I know what you're talking about. You're talking about Belton Cooper's book called The Death Trap.
Oh, yeah.
If you haven't read this book, it is a very, very good book. And I am not saying anything against Mr. Cooper. He was a hero. He did his job. But if you're not familiar with Mr. Cooper had the unfortunate job of being a repairman for the M4 Sherman. When these tanks were hit, and they were killed, or damaged, and people were killed inside them. And they brought him back to the back. He was just a young kid, and he would have to go in and take these bodies out. Sometimes the bodies were, the tank, caught fire. It was just horrible. I mean, again, I can't imagine him having to do that, taking these bodies out, having to clean out the blood, having to whitewash the inside, rewire everything, fill the hole, and send it back out. And to see it come back later with more dead kids, more dead Americans. And that's a terrible, horrible thing. And I'm not trying to say anything against this. That is his view. That's what he saw. He didn't see what we were killing. He didn't see, that we lost 10 tanks.
Yeah.
And he saw the 10 tanks that were lost and these kids that were killed. And that got into his head.
I see.
But he didn't see the 114 Panthers that we left out there smoking in a pile of, rubble.
Yeah, true.
So I will never say anything against Belton Cooper. The man was a hero. He did his job, and he saw the worst part of the war. As far as survivability, I'm telling people, go research this. Don't take our words for it. Do your own archives.
Please, yes.
Yeah, don't get it off Wikipedia. Don't get it off, some 1972 documentary. Research yourself. But I'm telling you, American tanker loss, we lost 3% of our tankers. People are like, oh, no, you're crazy. No. I'm telling you, when we started, out of 100% of our tankers, we lost 3%. We talked about Nicholas Moran. He's got a series of videos called "Oh Dang" or "Oh Bugger," the tank's on fire, and he talks about how easy it is to get out of the Sherman. Later on, the Sherman turret had 2 hatches, but when it was hit and they said abandon the tank, they could get out really quick. There was a floor emergency hatch that they could get out if there was damage to, the turrets or the hatches. Later, the hatches were modified with springs, so they were easy to pop out. Basically, all you had to do was stand up and jump out of the Sherman. It was a pretty easy tank to get out. And, it was armored, and it was fast. It was a good tank, and it was survivable. Once we got the wet ammo racks and it wasn't catching fire as much, it would still get hit, and you want to bail. They could just go out right through the top. There was only one hatch on the turret in the beginning, and they were like, hey, our loader would like to get out too.
I think we need an extra hatch there, yeah.
So they finally figured out to cut another hatch and put springs on it. And like I said, if you look at the archives and you look at the battle reports, 3%, and I mean it, 3% of American tankers were lost, killed in action from, getting the tank destroyed. There are tons of stories where the tank was hit and everybody bailed out. I mean, there's tons of documentaries like, oh, our Sherman, it'd go right through and we'd have to bail out. Yeah, you're alive.
Yeah, they got out. Yeah. Exactly.
There's a ton of German tanks and even our Soviet allies, they couldn't get out of the tanks. Try to get out of the T-34.
I was reading about some of those where it was almost like a puzzle to get yourself in and out of those things.
Well, yeah, Rubik's Cube came from the Soviet Union, so they had to make it a puzzle to get out. That's just some of the questions we've been asked. Russ, would you please cover some of the basics and the stats of the tank?
Yeah, I sure will. The M4 Sherman evolved from the M3 medium tank, which had its main armament in a side sponson mount. The M4 retained much of the previous mechanical design from the M3 medium tank, but put the main 75mm gun in a fully traversing turret. One feature, a one-axis gyro stabilizer, was not precise enough to allow firing when moving, but did help keep the reticle on the target, so that when the tank actually did stop to fire, the gun would be aimed in roughly the right direction.
Nice.
Yeah, that would be. The designer stressed mechanical reliability, ease of production and maintenance, durability, standardization of parts, and ammunition in a limited number of variants and moderate size and weight.
Right. Kind of like what we just covered.
Yeah, yeah, with able to transport these tanks overseas. These factors, combined with the Sherman's then superior armor and armament, outclassed German light and medium tanks fielded in 1939 to about 1942. The M4 went on to be produced in large numbers. It spearheaded many offensives by the Western Allies after 1942.
One of the stories that when I was researching everything, was our utter failure when we first got into the war in West Africa. We were actually, if you look at the battle, we charged 88 millimeter tanks that were hiding behind cactuses, and that they were in a standard cavalry charge in an open plain against these 88s, and they got destroyed because the commanders at that time didn't know how to use these tanks. So they're like, hey, these M4s at the beginning of the war were getting killed left and right. Yeah, they were charging 88s. Okay, there's nothing that can stand against an 88.
No,
Even the King Tiger, Jag Tigers, one of those would pretty much kill it.
that would, yeah. The designer of the M4 Sherman was the U.S. Army Ordnance Department. It was designed in 1940 and manufactured by several different companies.
Oh, there's so many
companies. I know.
Ford did it. Pullman did it.
Almost every locomotive or train locomotive company, was involved in making these things. Anywhere from the Baldwin Locomotive Works to the Pullman Standard Car Company.
Now, we were talking about why the M4 was the way it was, or why it is the way it is. One of the other things is people forget the Depression. We were just starting to come out of it, and money was tight. How much did one of these M4s cost?
The unit cost was about $44,556 all the way up to about $64,455. And that was in $1945. So anywhere from about $45,000 to $65,000 a piece.
I wish I could buy a Sherman for $44,000.
Today, I think I could probably come up with that kind of money. I'm hoping, yeah.
Yeah.
But that also depended kind of upon the variant of, the cost. That's why the big range like that. In 2017 dollars, you're talking probably about $610,000 to $870,000 a piece.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Let's buy it at the 45 price.
Exactly, yeah. They were produced, the prototype Sherman M4 was produced in September of 1941. Sherman tanks were produced between about February 1942 to July 1945.
Wow. Now, I know a lot of people want the specifications, but let's just go with the basics. Because there's so many variants.
Oh, I know, yes.
We would have to spend 3 episodes just talking about the variants.
Yes, yeah.
So give us the basic cut down specifications for the M4.
M4 Shermans weighed about anywhere between 33 and 42 tons. They were anywhere from 19 foot to 20 foot long, about 8 foot 7 inches wide to clear up to almost 10 foot wide in some of the variants. And it was about 9 foot high to about 9 foot 10 inches high. But it still come in under the the height of the Lee.
I love the Lee. 10 foot tall and bulletproof.
I think the Lee may be the tallest tank we've ever produced.
I think so.
The M4 Sherman had a crew of 5. It had a commander, a gunner, a loader, a driver, and an assistant driver / bow gunner. So he had a couple different jobs there.
Gotcha.
The main armament of the M4 Sherman was the 75 millimeter gun M3, carried anywhere from about 90 to 104 rounds of that particular armament. Or the M4 Sherman had a 76 millimeter gun.
How many rounds did that
have? About 71 rounds is what they carried there.
Now we're going to talk about the derp gun.
Oh, yeah.
What is the actual derp size?
The derp size is a 105 millimeter howitzer gun. They carried about 66 rounds.
And when they found out those white phosphorus rounds were working pretty well, I bet they packed a few more of those.
I bet they probably did, yes.
What's the secondary armament on those things?
Secondary armament on the M4 Shermans, they had a 50 caliber Browning M2HB machine gun, and on average they'd carry about 300 to 600 rounds of that with
50 caliber.
Yeah.
That'll
And
knock,
once again, anti-aircraft, that kind of stuff too.
well, that'd definitely knock an airplane out of the air.
Yeah, it would, big time. It had two 30 caliber Browning M1919A4 machine guns, and about 6,000, 7,000 rounds of that's what they would carry.
Oh, for the Browning 30 cals?
Yeah,
Wow.
for both of those. The M4 Sherman had a Spicer manual synchromesh transmission, had 5 forward gears and 1 reverse gear on that.
That's better than the French tanks that have 1 forward gear and 5 reverse.
Yes.
I'm kidding.
Oh, no. Nope. I'm giving you out his personal email address right now, folks.
No offense to our French. I'm sorry. Couldn't resist. Oh, we're going to get hate mail. But what kind of suspension?
It had a vertical volute spring suspension system or a horizontal volute spring suspension system. So it had a couple different versions.
Yeah, I think the one I liked the most was the HVSS. I think that
The horizontal volute,
yeah. What kind of fuel are we talking about?
Yeah, the M4 Shermans had a fuel capacity of anywhere between 138 to 175 U.S. gallons. And that also depends
On the variants.
on the variants, yeah.
So what's the operational range of one of those things when it's got a full tank of gas?
The M4 Shermans could operate out to about 100 to 150 miles on one tank of gas. And that depends on the variants too.
In the road.
And the road conditions, what they were operating on, yes.
I'm not trying to start any trouble, but your cat is trying to play with your rear.
She's...
She does like to use her front claw or front paws, and she thinks she's massaging you.
Yeah.
She's not.
No. I don't know how to explain it, but yeah.
Yeah, she's kind of a strange one.
Lightning is definitely lightning.
Yeah, lightning's a handful. That's all we're going to say.
Oh, I know.
We almost are in about an hour, and I hate to say it, but we're going to have to make 2 episodes of this M4. What do you think?
I think so. I mean, we still got quite a bit more to talk about.
We still have the battles and everything, and we got to talk about how every tanker thought or every infantry saw a German tank thought it was a Tiger. Russ, you want to hear something fun? How many actual Sherman versus Tiger fights were there?
I don't know. How many?
Would you believe if I said only 3?
Only 3. Wow.
All right, we'll have to talk about that in the next episode because people are going to be like, no, there was tigers all over and they were just crawling all over. I'm like,
to be continued, folks.
Yeah.
This is leaving us on the edge of our seats here, guys.
Well, it'll give you a reason to tune in. And like I said, we are on all the major podcast stuff now, iPod, Podbean, Spotify, even Facebook. But one things that we want to push is the YouTube. And if you guys want to listen to us on YouTube, you just type in 2 tankers and a cat, we pop right up. Or if you got Google Home, you just go, hey, Google, play 2 tankers and a cat podcast. It will actually kick on. I did it at my house the other day.
Oh, man, that's awesome. That's great.
So we're getting out there.
Oh, we are.
Now, we still have our donate button to anybody wanting to send us some money to help out with operational costs.
Please check out our website, www.twotankersandcat.com.
We
a
even
lot
have,
of good information there.
And throw us some likes on Facebook and stuff like that.
Yes. Help us get our name out there still, and we're still growing. To be honest with you, here within the last couple of days of us recording this actual episode of the podcast, we've reached 1,000 downloads, believe it or not, on
No way.
on Podbean. Yes.
And we've only got basically 10 episodes actually out.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. It's incredible.
And it's thanks to you guys tuning in. We really appreciate it.
Yes, we do.
It's only going to get better, folks. We actually have some interviews coming up with some really big names in the tank world. We actually have a Twitch streamer that has agreed to come out and give us some interviews. We actually got some old tankers that want to talk to us.
Yes.
We got an actual Sherman tanker from the Korean War, and he'll tell you about his battles against the T-34-85 and how he smoked them.
Oh, man. So, yeah.
You'll have to tune in, people.
Yes, exactly. This is only going to get bigger and better as we go. We're still learning as we go, and
all right. Well,
I'm excited to see where it goes.
I'm going to go ahead and close episode 12. We appreciate you tuning in. This is Charlie signing out.
And this is Russell. Happy tanking. And as always, take care.